First things first with Nigeria is that it is a federal state. It's got 36 states, right? The capital is Abuja. It is not Lagos, right? No matter how many people think that it is, because Lagos is the most populous city on the entire continent of Africa. Um, but that's not the case. But really, rather than, I mean, just knowing that it has states is fine. But the more important thing to really know is the question is how they deal with what's called the national question. And the national question is who should rule and how should they rule? And because the reason they have to ask this question more than most countries is because Nigeria, in large part, is a country that shouldn't exist. It's a extremely fragmented state. There's anywhere between 300 and 400 particular separate ethnic groups. However, there are three major ones: the House of Fulani in the north, the Yoruba in the southwest, and the Igbo in the southeast. Right, and the House of Fulani are predominantly Muslim and come from a tradition of large kingdoms. The Igbo are primarily Roman Catholic and come from a tradition of small village chiefdoms. Right, the Yoruba are a little bit mixed, but about half Muslim, half Christian. So they, for the most part, in terms of their indigenous language, they don't speak other people. The Yoruba don't speak Igbo, right? And the British, when they established Nigeria as a colony, or when they were in control of Nigeria, they imposed English. So pretty much everyone, I mean, English is the predominant language in Nigeria. Pretty much everyone speaks English. But the point I'm getting at is it shouldn't exist because there would be no rational basis for the Yoruba and the House of Fulani and the Igbo to all have any of the other ethnic groups to form any sort of country known as Nigeria. Nigeria is not even an English. I'm sorry, it's not even by the wife of some colonial administrator because of the Niger River. And so what this all means is there's an extremely fragmented state, and these conflicts will often see. And this also ties into really the resources, right? If you are one state with many nations, as we've drawn that distinction before, the difference between a nation and a state. If you are one state with several nations and majority of resources are controlled in one small discrete area, in this case oil, which is in Biafra, then that is going to cause a lot of conflict, right? Who gets to benefit? If you are minority ethnic group, right, in Nigeria, and you have no feeling of kinship to other groups, and the state comes calling to benefit the rest of the state with a resource that's on your land, you may want to do your own thing. And that's how you end up getting the civil war of the late 70s and the early 80s in the Biafra region. And this also means that Nigeria is a rentier state. And that's a term that you should know because we've used it before. Iran was a rentier state. It's still kind of a quasi-rentier state. Mexico is kind of a rentier state, or it used to be before it began to diversify. But a rentier state, right, is, you just think of it, the easiest way is that it's a economy heavily supported by state expenditure. And what that really means is the state is a landlord. In the same way that if you and your family, you live in a building, and that building has maybe 10 units in it, 10 different apartment units, you pay rent to whomever owns that building. Their resource is that building, and they are receiving income from that. And if everyone moves out, you get no income if you are the owner of that building. In the same way, Nigeria has resources, not rooms or apartments, but oil fields, and they rent those out to maybe British Petroleum, right, or Texaco, or any of these other major oil companies, and they open up oil rigs and oil fields, or the infrastructure to drill for oil, and they pay rent to operate there. So they do that, and if all of a sudden maybe there was too much political instability, for example, in Nigeria, and they all say, hey, it's not worth it, and they leave. Nigeria is kind of screwed if they have no other source of revenue, because they've been relying upon that one resource, right? Also called the resource curse. So that's what a rentier state is, and it's a problem, is because you become completely dependent upon those rents. All right, so hold on one second. I need to close the door. Okay. I'm gonna real quick see. Do we have? We're always thinking system
Hey, you
structure.
had a question.
What's up, Kevin?
Hey, you had a question in the like the chat thing.
Hold on, my computer's being a little slow here.
He said the president is both head of state and government? Question mark.
Yeah.
And his mic is broke.
Yes, that is correct. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, head of both state and head of government. This is a presidential system. It is a federal system. Nigeria is really similar to the United States in a lot of ways, in terms of at least the structures that exist and the functions that are meant to be carried out by those structures. Our president here is Muhammadu Buhari, who's kind of an interesting fellow in that he actually took over the government back in the 80s, as part of a military coup, and then he left, and he was deposed by another coup, and then he comes back and he's elected. So anyway, one thing that's also worth noting is that it used to be a parliamentary system rather than presidential, and we have to remember the difference between those two, which is that the executive and the legislative are fused together in the parliamentary system, thus weakening the power of the executive and providing more power to the legislature. Whereas the presidential system gives a little bit more authority and power to the executive, and is separate. The president was meant to be sort of a unifying figure. And the reason they switched from parliamentary to presidential was because we talked about these ethnic divisions, and there were so many of them, right? We talked about 300 to 400 separate ethnic groups. Many political parties fell along those ethnic and religious lines, that in a parliamentary system where you need to build a majority to govern, no one could build a majority, and they had a hard time even building a coalition government. So it made for a very weak system of government. So they shifted to a presidential system. And the president, I said, is meant to be a unifying figure. And a good example of this is that the president must receive at least 25% of the votes cast in 2/3 of all Nigerian states, right? So that's 24 states out of 36, right? 2/3. And you gotta get 25%. And so what this does is it prevents a purely regional candidate, right? The House of Fulani are the most numerous ethnic group within Nigeria, and so it would be possible that they could sort of run the table on a lot of these elections, and it would just be a candidate who was only ruling on behalf of the House of Fulani rather than on the entire state of Nigeria. And so that was meant to, this 25% threshold was meant to mitigate that. The other thing you should know about the executive is that the president is the strongest structure in the government, right? There is federalism. There are checks and balances. These are all laid out in the Constitution. But in reality, the government at the local level is completely dependent upon the federal government. And the executive dominates both other branches of government. So why? Why would Nigeria have an executive that is so much more dominant than perhaps the executive in the United States? And this is where we look at political culture and historical instances, history to help us explain this. And Nigeria is heavily influenced by the period of military rule. So there was a presidential, they shifted from parliamentary to presidential in 1979. They said you can only rule for 2 terms. And then in the 80s, there was a series of coups, right, where the military took over, overthrew the government. A new regime was in place. Right? You'll recall a regime is when you change the rules of the game rather than changing the players. And they were all saying, listen, right now we're just going to sort of like tread water and hold the government until it's ready to transition to democracy. But you can imagine that many military rulers all had extremely varying ideas of what it meant to transition to democracy. So things kind of get back to normal by 1999. And by normal, I mean they're holding elections again, civilian rule, etc. Um, but there's a tradition of authoritarianism and the suspension of the rule of law. And this constant regime change is a large reason why the government suffers from low levels of legitimacy. One way that the government has tried to build legitimacy is to give people faith in elections. Prior to 1999, elections were consistently suspended. They would say, "Oh, here, there's an election coming up in October," and they'd say, "Oh no, we're suspending that. There's too much risk right now," or something. So, uh, the the INEC, National Electoral Commission, was set up, and originally it suffered from a lot of the same things that plague the rest of Nigeria's agencies and government and bureaucracy, which was corruption. But since 2011, it's kind of been a force for good. It purged a lot of uh, voter fraud that was taking place. It opened a more secure ballot system, and it has helped to increase legitimacy and faith in the electoral process. So this is one of those things that's good to know because when we think about FRQ questions that we might get, they sometimes you'll see like a comparative question where it says, I could see them saying it with Mexico, for example, right? Describe the electoral process um, in Mexico and Nigeria before the 2000s. Explain a change and the reason for that change and what that has done for the legitimacy. Like I could see a question like that. So that's why it's good to know things like INEC. All right, let's talk legislature. So the legislature here is pretty much the same as our legislature, but it's a system. There used to be more parties, but INEC has regulated the electoral process in a way that sort of cuts down on how many parties were able to run in a given election. And they're all elected first past the post, single member districts. They're meant to be in multicultural, multi-ethnic districts to um, make it so it's not people that are purely helping one group of people. However, the it doesn't really matter because the legislature is pretty weak. They are very rarely are they an effective check on the president, and they don't have a ton of power relative to the president. Our judiciary, okay, is also similar in that constitutionally the there's an independent judiciary that has judicial review. And it actually used to be a lot stronger in the very early days of the independent state of Nigeria, which was because there was a strong and robust legal tradition under the British, right, the British common law. However, that sort of eroded under authoritarian leaders, and there's been a weakening of the judiciary. They do have judicial review, but it's not really a true check in the way that it is in, for example, the United States or, well, yeah, United States. Now, it's also worth noting that the structure of the courts is essentially just like ours, local, state, federal, but one significant and important change that shows how ethnic or religious cleavages are dealt with, which is that the northern region, which is predominantly Muslim, is allowed to also operate courts of Sharia law. All right, so Sharia law, we'll recall, from when we studied Iran was that the law was not based on the Constitution; it was based on the Quran. And so this is a way of building legitimacy for the government, is allowing people who are religiously diverse to engage in practices that are important to them. But it also kind of complicates things sometimes. Oh, in terms of powers of, it's it's similar to the United States in that both chambers are able to introduce legislation. And I'm going to cover some important stuff right here, okay? And that is a lot of terms that I think you guys are reading without necessarily understanding them. And the the four terms, but one I already covered, are rentier state, parastatal organization, corporatism, and uh, clientelism, or the patron-client system. And so I want to start with corporatism, okay? Because all these exist in some capacity in Nigeria and also several other countries. So corporatism, I think, is a term that you guys have been a little bit, had a hard time, you know, understanding. And the best way is to think of it like a corporation, right? We talked about Apple, I believe, as an example. You have a marketing department, you have a research and development department, you have an overseas sales department, so on and so forth. And there's a head of that department, and they sort of interact with like the head of the company, like Tim Cook or whomever, right, or the CFO. And so the whole point of this is to have sort of a flow between the top and the bottom of this structure, or the system, I should say, which is a corporation. So in this case, corporatism in the government allows political input from selected interest groups outside of the government structure. And this can be business, labor, other interest groups. They're all bargaining with the state over policy, and normally that's going to be economic. Now, the level to which the state actually listens, okay, or cares, is going to vary. Mexico, there's corporatism, but it's kind of like democratic corporatism in that, some of the heads of these various unions are elected, and and Mexico actually listens to them in a way, where in Iran and Nigeria, we see a lot less of that. Corporatism is sort of usually a feature of authoritarian systems, because it lets the government select the organizations that are going to represent the public, and it makes, by allowing organizations but selecting them, it makes it appear less authoritarian than it actually is. But you might say, Mexico and Nigeria are democratic regimes. They're not authoritarian regimes. And this is true. But they both have a history of authoritarianism. And it's not incompatible, because sometimes the interests are actually listened to. And so this then gets into how are these interests, what structures exist in this corporatism framework. And that's where we get the parastatals. So parastatals are these semi-autonomous, or in some cases totally autonomous, government agencies. And a parastatal is really a corporation owned by the state and designed to provide some sort of commercial or social welfare service. So in Iran, there are more social welfare services. In Mexico, there are more commercial. A good example is Pemex, okay, in Mexico. In Iran, we have these charities that are kind of like organizations that, in theory, are helping like wives of soldiers who died in the Iran-Iraq war, or whatever it's called, but ultimately not really doing a whole lot for the interests of the people. And so that's where parastatals come in, is that they sort of fit into this corporatism framework, and the state can use them to provide services, or just merely to prop up their own power. And you're saying to yourself, okay, well, how would they prop up their own power using these parastatals? And that's where we get finally to the patron-client system, which is another way of getting support from the people. And they might appoint people to the head of these parastatals as part of this system of patronage. So, for example, Nigeria, right? Oil revenue is the primary means by which Nigeria earns revenue. And it could be that in this system of corporatism, right, there is some, oil workers, energy sector workers, they do have a means by which they can connect or link to the government, but it's very structured, and also the people at the top of this parastatal are oftentimes appointed by the president for being his buddy, right? That's patronage. So clientelism provides benefits or favors to a single person or a small group in return for public support. And we see it in China, Russia, Mexico, Nigeria, and that's kind of how these all link together, right? Clientelism as a way of gaining support, parastatals as a structure that we can then use to help put these supporters in power, and corporatism as a means of maintaining that structure while giving the people the veneer, or I guess perhaps the illusion of having a means of connecting with the government to articulate their interests. All right, let's go ahead then. So that brings us then to the bureaucracy, right? Because what better way to continue this patron-client system than when you can award jobs to people, okay? And this can be at the highest levels, or it can be, you can see even taking a tax, it can involve a bribe, right? You got to grease the wheels a little bit. And so um, this bureaucracy is pretty big, in large part because the British established a fairly large bureaucratic system during the days of colonialism. Most people generally accept that the bureaucracy is corrupt and inefficient, although it's not. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. There are plenty of civil servants, right, that are there for the right reasons. However, if you live in a country where the highest GDP on the entire continent, right? So Nigeria has the highest GDP in Africa, and yet 70 odd percent of people live in poverty. Okay, the government job, being able to know somebody and get a job in bureaucracy, is probably a pretty good way to make a buck or two. However, this is really going to undermine the legitimacy of the government. All right, so this brings us to political recruitment then, right? So who's getting these jobs? And again, this is just a continuation of what we were already talking about, which is that there is a patron-client system, and it's a hard system to break, right? It's a hard cycle to break, especially when you're a rentier state. When oil is where the money's at, patronage doles out jobs in the oil industry at the expense of developing other industries. And so then everyone wants to get into that industry, and so those jobs become valuable, and the cycle continues. So there have been one of the big policy ideas that has been floated by every presidential candidate for the last 25 years is, I'm going to end corruption. I'm going to end corruption. But there have been a lot of strides that have been made, but it's hard. The media, if we're talking about linked institutions, we're talking about parastatals and this corporatist interest group system. The media is actually a nice little ray of light, because there's actually a pretty long tradition of a strong independent press, more so in the South than in the North. In the North, there's been a lot of trouble with Boko Haram, which is essentially a terrorist organization that has taken over territory. However, um, people, there's um, the ability to be fairly outspoken and critical without fear of reprisal. So this is just to kind of give you an idea of where it's a deadly country to be a journalist. So it's, you can just sort of look at that. You don't see Nigeria on there, but it's not entirely safe necessarily to be a foreign journalist. Right. So I've been talking a lot about legitimacy and how do we establish it. Elections are becoming more legitimate. We talked about INEC. The thing that I want to talk to you about is constitutionalism. So we sort of accept that the government can only do things within the constraints of what the Constitution allows, the powers that are provided by the Constitution. This is a form of legitimacy, and that people accept the Constitution as a guiding set of principles. And this has really eluded Nigeria because they've had a lot of leaders, military figures, autocrats who have felt free to disregard it across these several regime changes. And so it becomes very hard to build support for constitutionalism when so many are working around the system. They don't apply it to themselves. Rule of law is questionable. There's vast patronage networks. So the Constitution, I mean, there's been the first one, I believe, was in 1918 or so, before Nigerian independence, and there's been like 9 separate constitutions ever since then. Yeah. So okay, we talked about constitution. We talked about most of this: bicameral, federalist, Sharia law in the north, checks and balances, limited judicial review. Okay. So the last thing to really talk about here is the role that history has played in this. And I think I've mostly kind of covered this, but a lot of the conflict that happens in Nigeria is because of the colonial history in particular. But even before the colonial history, there was a great variation in how governing took place. Right, there were kingdoms in the north, vast kingdoms, in some cases part of Islamic caliphates when Islam was introduced into northern Africa in the 900s or so. Christianity was introduced in the 1800s through missionaries that were there on behalf of the British. And I guess what I'm trying to say is a lot of this colonial era really created a state that was bound to have some sort of conflict through these artificial lines that were drawn. And so even though they gain independence, okay, like when you're a colony and none of the structures of self-government have been given to you or have been practiced or developed over the course of your time as a colony, then all of a sudden you're just cut free and speed good luck. There's going to be a power vacuum and everyone's going to begin jockeying for power. And when you have lots of ethnic divisions that are all jockeying for power, you're bound to have conflict. And that's pretty much it. Buhari is our president. We talked about ethnic cleavages already. Oh, yeah, last thing. Okay, party system. So there is a multi-party system. However, parties are not powerful. People are powerful in Nigeria. All right, so it's not as though you're rising through the ranks of the party until eventually you're presented as a candidate. Oftentimes, it's sort of cults of personality, or it's people that were strong in the military. The military is an enormously powerful structure within the Nigerian government. And so when somebody then is elected, for example, as president, they're not nearly as accountable to their party as, say, the PM in the UK or even the president in the United States. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Patron client we talked about, citizens. Yeah, so that's pretty much. A word you need to know is prebendialism. That is the variety or the sort of type of here I'll flash back so you can see it. It's a where's it at here? Prebendialism, and it is a sort of like unique Nigerian type of patron clientelism, and it really just means that everyone's sort of like those in these bureaucratic agencies. They treat their agencies or their departments like their own individual fiefdoms, where they dole out favors. So it's kind of it's a way of describing what is a more powerful form of the patron-client relationship. Current regime, democratic. Yeah, yeah, it's a democratic federalist regime. That is the current system that we have. I mean, we think of system, structure, function. The system's in place, and the structures are there to support that system. Functionally, they're a little weak, but it's democratic.
Are the laws made the same as in the U.S.? Like similar, like legislative process?
Yeah,
Okay.